when a beat-up 2003 Chevy pickup with a cracked passenger window and a tailgate held shut by bungee cord rolled into the parking lot of the Hartwell Innovation Summit. The valet attendant didn't even bother walking over. He just watched from the booth, arms crossed, until the truck found its own spot at the far edge of the lot where the pavement turned to gravel. The Hartwell Summit was held every 2 years at the Fairmont in downtown Calgary. It was the kind of event where the parking lot told you everything you needed to know about who mattered. This year there were 2 Teslas, a Range Rover with dealer plates still on it, and a black Porsche Cayenne that belonged to the keynote sponsor. The pickup looked like it had been driven in from a different century. Adrian Kowalski got out first. He was 41, with calloused hands, and a quiet way of moving that didn't match the venue. He wore the only dress shirt he owned, a blue one that was slightly too big in the shoulders, and he'd pressed it himself that morning at the motel 2 blocks over. The iron had left a faint crease running the wrong direction across the front. He noticed it in the elevator reflection and decided it didn't matter. His daughter Ren climbed down from the passenger side, 8 years old, wearing her good cardigan and the serious expression she always wore when she understood something important was happening even if she didn't know what exactly. She was carrying a folder. Adrian had asked her to hold it while he drove, and she'd held it the entire 2-hour trip from Red Deer without asking once what was inside. "You okay?" he asked her. "Are you nervous?" "A little." She thought about that with the gravity of someone twice her age. Good nervous or bad nervous? Ask me again in a few hours. They walked toward the entrance together, Ren matching his pace exactly, the folder tucked under her arm like it contained something fragile. The lobby of the Fairmont smelled like cedar and money. Registration tables lined the far wall, staffed by young women in matching blazers who were very good at smiling at people without quite seeing them. Adrian presented his badge confirmation on his phone. The woman who processed it glanced at his shirt, then at Ren, and her smile stayed perfectly in place while her eyes said something entirely different. "The innovation track presentations are in Salon C," she said. "Second floor. Elevators to your left." She paused. "Is your daughter registered as a guest?" "She's with me." Another pause. "I'll need to add her as a companion. There's a $25 day pass. That's fine." Adrian paid it without arguing. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with the people at the front desk cost more energy than it was worth. They took the elevator up. Ren read the floor directory with focused attention. "What's a concurrent session?" "A talk happening at the same time as another talk. That seems wasteful." "It does, yeah." Salon C was already filling when they arrived. Round tables, good chairs, projector screens at the front. The other presenters in the innovation track were easy to spot. They came in groups, wore matching lanyards from their companies, set up laptops with corporate wallpapers. One team from a Vancouver tech firm had a portable display stand and a branded tablecloth. Another group from Montreal was rehearsing talking points in a corner near the window. Adrian found 2 seats near the back and put his jacket on the chair beside him for Ren. She sat down, set the folder carefully on the table in front of her, and looked around the room with the patient attention of a child who had learned to be comfortable in places she didn't quite belong. He had been bringing her to things like this since her mother left when Ren was 4. Not because he wanted to, but because Mrs. Okafor, the neighbor who usually watched her, had a hip replacement scheduled and the backup plan had fallen through the week before. Ren had adapted the way she always adapted, quietly, completely, without complaint. "Those people have a banner," she observed. "They do. Should you have a banner? Probably." She considered this. "What does yours say, if you had one?" Adrian thought about it. "I don't know. Something about soil sensors." "That doesn't sound like a banner." "No," he agreed. "It really doesn't." He was presenting on a precision agriculture monitoring system he'd built over the past 3 years in the workshop behind his house in Red Deer. He'd started after the 3rd consecutive drought season, wiped out a third of his cousin's crop yield on a canola farm 2 hours east. The existing sensor systems on the market were expensive, required proprietary software subscriptions, and were designed for large commercial operations that could afford the overhead. Small family farms, the kind his family had farmed for 2 generations, couldn't use them practically. So Adrian had built something different. A low-cost, open-source soil monitoring network that could be deployed across a full quarter section for under $800 in materials, integrated with any standard smartphone, and maintained without a technical background. He'd tested it for 2 full growing seasons on his cousin's farm, then 3 neighboring farms who'd heard about it. The yield improvement data was in the folder Ren was holding. He hadn't come here expecting to win anything. He'd come because the registration fee was $200, and $200 felt like a reasonable amount to spend on the chance that someone in this building might take his work seriously. He had not expected to be noticed before he even reached his seat. That's him. He heard it from 2 tables away. A man's voice, low and certain. He didn't look up immediately. He'd learned that looking up too quickly gave people the satisfaction of knowing they'd landed a shot. He looked up slowly. The speaker was a man in his 50s, silver-haired, dressed in the way that certain kinds of successful people dressed. Everything expensive, nothing showy. He was leaning slightly toward the woman beside him, speaking behind his hand in the manner of someone who considered themselves subtle. The woman beside him was the one who mattered. Adrian knew who she was before she turned to look at him. Victoria Hartwell, CEO of Greenbridge AgTech, the largest agricultural technology company in Western Canada, and the summit's primary founding sponsor. It was her name on the building's event signage. Her company's logo was on every conference bag. She was 44, with the kind of focused stillness that came from spending years in rooms where you had to project certainty even when you felt anything but. Her hair was dark, cut short, and clean. She wore a blazer the color of slate over a cream shirt, and small silver earrings that Adrian noticed only because they caught the light when she turned. She turned to look at him with the same unhurried precision she probably brought to everything. Her eyes moved from his face to his shirt to the empty table in front of him to Ren and back. She said something to the man beside her, too quiet for Adrian to catch. The man smiled in a way that was worse than a laugh. Adrian looked back down at his phone. His presentation notes were on the screen. He knew them by heart, had known them by heart for weeks, but having something to look at made it easier to pretend the moment hadn't happened. Ren had seen it. She always saw things like that. "Is that someone important?" she asked, voice low. "The woman in the gray jacket. She runs a big company that does similar work to what I do." "Oh." Ren looked in Victoria's direction with the frank assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to disguise curiosity as indifference. "She has the same earrings as Mrs. Okafor." "Don't stare." "I'm not staring. I'm looking." The morning sessions ran before the innovation track presentations. Adrian sat through a keynote about supply chain resilience and a panel discussion on sustainable packaging that had nothing to do with agriculture. Ren colored in her notebook. She'd brought it specifically for situations like this, and occasionally asked him questions in a whisper about things she'd heard from the panelists. What's a value chain? All the steps between a thing being made and a person buying it, like from the farm to the grocery store. Exactly like that. She wrote something in her notebook. He didn't ask what. During the coffee break, he took Ren to find something to eat from the hospitality table. The pastries were small and expensive looking. She picked a blueberry scone with the deliberateness of someone making an important decision. He was pouring coffee when Victoria Hartwell appeared beside him. Up close, she was more tired-looking than her professional photographs suggested. There were shadows under her eyes that makeup didn't quite cover, and a tension around her jaw that he recognized as the particular kind that came from being responsible for things that didn't stop being your responsibility just because you stepped away from your desk. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, not a question. She'd learned his name already, which meant she'd looked him up, which meant he'd registered as something worth noting. "I understand you're presenting in the innovation track this afternoon." That's right. She studied him the way she'd studied him from across the room, measuring, cataloging. "I've reviewed the summit submissions. Your materials were interesting, but I want to be direct with you." She said it the way people said they wanted to be direct when they had already decided what they were going to say and were framing it as a courtesy. This track is competitive. The other presenters have institutional backing, pilot programs with measurable scale, industry partnerships. What you're proposing is ambitious, but a single-season trial on a handful of farms in central Alberta isn't going to carry weight with the judging panel. Adrian looked at her steadily. "I have 2 full seasons of data, 4 farms, 87 sensor nodes." Something moved briefly behind her expression, then it settled back into professional composure. "That's more than your submission indicated." The submission had a word limit. The man who had been beside her earlier appeared at her shoulder. She introduced him without looking away from Adrian. "This is Graham Elliott, our VP of Research and Development." Elliott looked at Adrian the way people looked at things that were technically present but not worth full attention. "Kowalski, Red Deer, right? Small-scale operation? I work at a grain elevator by day. I built this in my workshop." Elliott smiled the smile of a man who found something charming that he did not find impressive. "That's a real grassroots story. Good for you. Honestly." He glanced at Wren, who was eating her scone and watching the exchange with the open attention of a child who hasn't learned yet that adults prefer to be observed less directly. Brought your daughter? My sitter had surgery. Right. He looked back at Adrian. The point, Miss Hartwell is making is that the innovation track tends to reward solutions that are ready to scale. What you've described, a DIY sensor network for small farms, it's a nice local solution, but it's not really the conversation this summit is set up to have. Adrian set his coffee down. He kept his voice even. With respect, that's exactly the conversation this summit should be having. 63% of farms in Canada operate under 500 acres. None of the precision agriculture solutions currently on the market are economically viable for them. The technology exists. The barrier is cost and accessibility. That's the problem I've solved. A pause. Victoria was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something in it had shifted slightly from the beginning of the conversation. Present your data, she said finally. If it's as strong as you're suggesting, the panel will weigh it. She walked away before he could respond. Elliot followed, leaning toward her ear as they went. Whatever he said, she didn't react to it visibly. Wren watched them go. She wasn't that mean, she said. No, Adrian agreed. She wasn't. The man was a little mean. He was, yeah. She finished her scone. Are you still nervous? More than before. She nodded like that was the correct answer. The innovation track presentations began at 2 in the afternoon. The room had filled considerably since the morning. Additional attendees who had registered specifically for this track. A few journalists with lanyards that said media, and a cluster of agricultural industry observers who sat together near the windows and spoke to each other in the focused shorthand of people who were genuinely evaluating. There were 5 presentations. Adrian was 4th. The first 2 were from companies. Clean decks, confident presenters, polished delivery. Both were working on drone-based field monitoring systems with impressive satellite imagery. The data was strong. The crowd responded well. Adrian watched the judging panel take notes. The third presentation was from a university research team out of Saskatchewan. Young researchers, nervous energy, but genuinely interesting work on mycorrhizal network mapping. The panel perked up for that one. Then it was Adrian's turn. He stood up from the table where Wren was sitting, handed her his phone for something to do while he was up there, and walked to the front of the room. He had no display stand, no branded tablecloth, no video introduction, just a laptop connected to the room's projector, and a folder of printed data that he'd put together himself at the FedEx in Red Deer 2 days before. He looked out at the room, the panel. Victoria in the second row, with a pen in her hand and her expression carefully neutral. Elliot beside her, arms crossed. The media people, the industry observers, 140 people who had already made certain assumptions about what the next 15 minutes would look like. He thought about Wren at the back table, holding his phone and eating the second scone she'd quietly acquired from somewhere. He thought about his cousin's farm. The season they'd lost a third of the canola yield to conditions that better soil monitoring would have caught in time, the amount of money that represented. The conversation they'd had about whether the farm was going to survive another year like that. He started talking. He didn't use the scripted opening he'd rehearsed. He started with his cousin. He talked about what a bad drought season actually looked like from the ground. Not as data, not as percentage yield loss, but as a family sitting around a kitchen table in August, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work for another year. He talked about calling 4 different companies about precision agriculture solutions and being told their base packages started at $12,000 a year, subscription not included. The room was quiet in the way that rooms sometimes got quiet when something unexpected was happening. He moved to the technical portion. He walked through the sensor design, the deployment model, the data integration. He explained the decisions he'd made and why, each component chosen for durability in prairie conditions, cost, and the practical reality that the people using this system wouldn't have an IT department to call when something went wrong. He'd made it so that a farmer with a smartphone and a basic toolkit could install and maintain the entire network. Then he put up the data, 2 full growing seasons, 4 farms ranging from 280 to 600 acres, yield variance reduction, irrigation efficiency improvement, early stress detection catches that had prevented 2 separate crop losses. He heard someone in the industry observer section say something quietly to the person beside them. Both of them leaned forward. The panel chair spoke first. Mr. Kowalski, the unit cost you've cited, $800 for full quarter section coverage. That includes materials and installation? Materials only. Installation takes about a day. I've done it with volunteers on each farm, mostly neighbors and family. If you were paying installation labor at market rate, you'd be looking at another $400 to $600, still under $1,500 total compared to market alternatives. The most affordable commercial option I'm aware of starts at $9,000 for comparable coverage before subscription costs. The woman from the panel who Adrian had identified as the agricultural economist leaned forward. Your open source integration, how does that interact with existing farm management software? He answered. Then another question. Then another. They asked about scalability, about security vulnerabilities, about weather tolerance, about whether he'd considered partnering with any cooperatives for broader rollout. He answered all of it. Every question he'd either tested or thought through or both. This wasn't theory. This was 3 years of late evenings in a workshop while Ren slept, running tests on prototypes that failed 6 different ways before they worked the right way. From the second row, Victoria Hartwell hadn't written anything in several minutes. She was just watching him. Graham Elliott had uncrossed his arms somewhere around the third question. When the 15 minutes were done, Adrian thanked the panel and walked back to his seat. The applause was more than polite. It had texture to it, the specific quality of an audience responding to something they hadn't expected. Ren looked up from his phone when he sat down. How did it go? Good, I think. Did they ask a lot of questions? A lot, yeah. She handed him back his phone. That means they were interested, Mrs. Okafor always asks a lot of questions when she's interested in something. He smiled despite himself. Where did you get that second scone? There were extras on the table in the hallway. You just took them? There was a sign that said, "Please help yourself." He couldn't argue with that. The final presentation was from a Calgary-based startup working on AI-driven irrigation scheduling. It was impressive, better funded and more polished than anything Adrian had brought, and the data behind it was substantial. He watched it with the honest assessment of someone who respected good work, regardless of where it landed relative to his own. The panel deliberated for 45 minutes. Adrian and Ren sat in the lobby of Salon C. He bought her a sparkling water from the bar because she asked what the bubbles were for, and he ended up spending 20 minutes explaining carbonation in terms she found satisfying. He was mid-explanation when someone sat down across from them. Victoria Hartwell. Alone this time. No, Elliot. She looked at Ren first, then at Adrian. Something in her posture was different from every previous version of her he'd encountered over the course of the day. More tired, maybe, or more honest about the tiredness. She set her phone on the table face down, which he registered as deliberate. I owe you something, she said. Adrian waited. This morning. What I said to you about your submission. It was premature and it was dismissive, and I should not have delivered it before your presentation rather than after it. He looked at her carefully. Why did you? She held his gaze. It was the kind of question she'd probably rather he hadn't asked. Because I looked at who you were on paper, the elevator job, the single submission, no institutional affiliation, and I made an assumption about what your work would be, and I should know better than that. She paused. I started Greenbridge in a rented garage in Lethbridge when I was 29 years old with one investor who didn't fully believe in me and a product that didn't work properly until the 14th iteration. Someone in a nice jacket told me at an industry event in my first year that I was charming, but I should think about whether I was really cut out for it. She said it without self-pity, matter of fact, as if it were simply weather that had happened. I think about that person every time I open my mouth at an event like this. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Beside him, Ren had stopped drinking her sparkling water and was watching Victoria with the frank attention she'd deployed all day. Did you mean it? He asked. That someone in your shoes could solve a problem that yours can't. Victoria looked at him steadily. Your cost-to-coverage ratio is better than anything we've developed for the small farm segment, and we have tried. 2 internal projects in the last 4 years. Both shelved because we couldn't get the unit economics to work at the scale where it actually matters. She exhaled quietly. So yes, I meant it, and that's not an easy thing to say out loud. Graham Elliott didn't seem like he was ready to say it. Graham's not here right now. A beat. Why are you? Adrian asked. She considered that for a moment. Because my father farmed 300 acres outside Tabor for 30 years. He never used any technology more sophisticated than a moisture probe from the co-op. He retired with enough to pay off the land and not much else. And I've spent 15 years building a company that technically could have helped him and didn't, because our pricing model didn't include people like him. She looked down at her hands. Your work isn't just good engineering, it's the right problem. And I recognized that about 40 minutes into your presentation and spent the rest of it thinking about how I was going to talk to you afterward. Ren set down her sparkling water. My dad works really hard, she offered. with the directness of a child who sees no reason not to say what's true. Victoria looked at her. The professional composure cracked just slightly, like a pane of glass where the break was there but hadn't yet spread. "I can tell," she said. "He builds things that work." The results were announced back in Salon C 20 minutes later. The panel chair was thorough about it. She noted the quality of the entire field, acknowledged the university team from Saskatchewan specifically, and then said, with the crisp delivery of someone who considered clarity a courtesy, "The Innovation Track Award went to Adrian Kowalski for a precision agriculture monitoring solution that demonstrated measurable real-world impact, meaningful cost innovation, and the kind of practical engineering the industry needed more of and talked about less." The applause was different this time. Not polite, not textured, immediate and real. Graham Elliott did not clap. Adrian noticed that without particularly caring. Wren grabbed his arm with both hands. The award was a plaque and $12,000 in development funding. Adrian stood at the front of the room and held the plaque and tried to remember that he was supposed to say something. He said thank you to the panel. He said thank you to the farms that let him run tests, listed them by name, the Marchetti farm and the Nkosi farm and the Desjardins farm, because they deserved to have their names in a room like this. He looked at Wren at the back table, who was standing on her chair with both arms raised. "And my daughter Wren," he said, which made a few people in the audience smile in the particular way people smiled when something unexpectedly human appeared in a formal setting. Afterward, in the hallway, 3 people from the industry observer section found him before he'd even made it back to retrieve his jacket. A woman from the Alberta Federation of Agriculture asked for his contact information. A man from a rural cooperative network said they'd been trying to solve this exact problem for 2 years and wanted to set up a call. A journalist asked if she could write a piece on the system for a publication that focused on small farm economics. Adrian gave out his card, the plain white ones he'd printed at Staples, and answered questions for 20 minutes while Wren stood beside him, eating a third scone and listening. Victoria found him again when the crowd had thinned. "When you're ready to talk about next steps," she said, and handed him a card that was a different kind of card entirely from the ones he'd been receiving. Her direct number, handwritten on the back. "Not Greenbridge acquiring your work. I want to be specific about that. A partnership. Something where you stay involved in how this gets built and deployed. Your name on the technology." He looked at the card. "Why?" "Because if I buy it and absorbs it, it'll take 3 years and 4 committees before it reaches the farmers it's meant for. And because..." She stopped briefly. "Because the right way to do this is the way you do it, and I'd rather work with you than try to replicate what you've already built." He didn't say yes. He wasn't ready to say yes. He said he'd call after he'd spoken to someone who understood what he was signing. She nodded. "Smart. I'm getting that impression from you." She almost smiled. "I'm trying." The drive back to Red Deer took 2 hours. Wren fell asleep in the passenger seat before they'd cleared the city, her cardigan folded under her head as a pillow, the folder of data in her lap. She'd held it the whole day. Adrian drove through the flat stretch of highway between Calgary and Red Deer with the kind of quietness that wasn't emptiness. The plaque was in the back seat. The development funding would transfer in 3 to 5 business days. He had 7 voicemails he hadn't listened to yet. He thought about his cousin's farm. He thought about the Marchetti family, who had planted 300 acres of canola this spring using sensor data he'd helped them read. He thought about a lot of things that felt too large to hold all at once. His phone rang. He let it go to voicemail. Wren stirred. "Are we home?" "Not yet." "Go back to sleep." She settled. "Did we win?" "Yeah," he said, "we did." She made a small, satisfied sound and went back to sleep. He drove. The highway was straight and wide and lit by the long prairie light of a June evening in Alberta, and somewhere east of the city the fields started, winter wheat and canola, thousands of acres of land that needed exactly what he had built. He thought about the $800 network, about the Desjardins family adding a second quarter section next season, about what it would look like to see this deployed across 3 provinces instead of 4 farms. He thought about his workshop at home, the pegboards and the testing rigs and the whiteboard, with the system diagram that had been there so long the marker had faded in places. He'd started it the winter after Elena left, when Wren was 4, and the nights were very long, and he needed something that had rules, something where the problem stayed put until you solved it. He hadn't built it to win anything. He'd built it because his cousin's family couldn't afford to keep losing crops to a problem that had a solution, and nobody was making the solution accessible to them. But winning didn't feel wrong. It felt like proof of something he'd needed proving, not to the room full of people in Calgary who had eventually agreed, but to the quieter part of himself that had asked, in the long late hours in the workshop, whether any of it would ever matter beyond the 4 farms that already knew it did. He called Mrs. Okafor from the driveway when they got home. "I heard," she said before he could speak. Word had apparently already reached her through some channel he couldn't account for. She sounded delighted. "Your cousin called me." "My cousin called you? He called your cell and you didn't answer, so he found my number from Ren's school contact sheet." He cried a little bit. "I'm not going to tell him I told you that, but I'm telling you." Adrian sat in the truck in the driveway for a moment after he hung up. Ren was still asleep. The plaque was in the back seat. The evening light was going sideways across the fields to the east, the kind of light that made the flatlands look briefly like something out of a painting. He'd been in this driveway 1,000 times, coming home from the elevator, coming home from school pickup, coming home from the hardware store with parts for another prototype that might not work. It looked the same. He felt different, not finished, not arrived, just different, like a calculation that had been running for 3 years had finally returned a value. He woke Ren up gently. She got out of the truck still half asleep, the folder still in her arms. He reached over and took it from her so she could walk properly. "Carry me," she said. He picked her up, folder in one hand, her in the other arm. She was getting too big for this. She fell asleep again before he got to the door. He stood on the porch for a moment before going inside. The workshop light was on. He'd left it on that morning, which he usually didn't do. Through the small window, he could see the workbench, the pegboard, the faded whiteboard. The system that had started as a way to survive the quiet and become something that might change what small farms could afford to know about their own land. He went inside, put Ren to bed without fully waking her. Set the plaque on the kitchen table, made coffee because it was that kind of night, called his cousin back, and this time his cousin didn't cry, though it was a near thing. And then he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the plaque and the folder and the 7 unheard voicemails, and let himself just for a moment be exactly where he was, tired, uncertain about what came next, responsible for everything, more capable than anyone in that Calgary ballroom had expected, which had been true since long before they figured it out.